Imagine stepping off a train. You know, you have been riding for days, just listening to that rhythmic, hypnotic clatter of iron wheels on steel tracks.
Right, you're probably completely exhausted.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You're exhausted, your clothes are just thick with coal dust, but you feel connected to the modern world, right?
Yeah, you feel like part of this massive industrial machine.
Exactly. But then, the train slows, the doors open, you step down onto the dirt, you look past the engine, and the tracks they just stop,
They literally end.
right there in the mud. You are standing at the absolute edge of the engineered world in 1876.
Which is a terrifying place to be.
Really is. Behind you is an entire continent wired together by telegraphs and rails. But beyond you, it isn't just a sprawling wilderness. It is it's a mathematical and logistical impossibility.
Yeah, how do you move an entire army into that?
Exactly. Welcome to our deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we are immersing ourselves in the 1876 military campaign against the Sioux in Cheyenne.
The one that culminated in the Battle of the Little Bighorn?
That's the one. But our mission today is a bit different. We are not here to relitigate the legendary clash of personalities,
Right, we are looking right past George Armstrong Custer.
and Sitting Bull too. Instead, we are exploring this event as a massive, groaning, precarious logistical machine.
The hidden architecture of the campaign.
Yes. We are going to break down the terrifying mathematics of supply, the physical limits of 19th century infrastructure, and how a single steamboat, this amazing vessel called the Far West, literally carried the boundary between what was possible and what was not.
And we have an incredibly rich stack of sources to guide us today.
We really do.
We are looking at the deeply personal sensory diaries of Elizabeth Custer. We're examining General Alfred Terry's official military reports, pulling apart legal affidavits about military orders, and even bringing in texts on modern recreation and underwater archaeology.
Just understand those long-term echoes of the campaign. It really is a story about the systems that hold up the stage of history.
So let's start by setting the scene.
Yeah, because the psychological contrast between what the United States believed about itself in the summer of 1876 and the brutal reality on the ground out west is just staggering.
It is a profound disconnect. I mean, the year is 1876. Back east, the United States is throwing itself a massive party.
The Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia.
Exactly. And the narrative of the day, broadcast across the entire eastern seaboard, is one of absolute inevitable American dominance.
Right.
This is the era of the coreless steam engine. Have you seen pictures of this thing?
Oh, it's massive.
It's this towering 1,400 horsepower mechanical behemoth. It was the centerpiece of the exhibition.
And it powered, what, hundreds of other machines at the fair simultaneously?
Yeah, all at once. The message was incredibly clear. American industry has mastered nature. We have booming factories, precision engineering, and just infinite potential.
And the ultimate symbol of that supremacy, the thing physically binding the nation together, was the railroad,
The Iron Horse.
taming the continent. But here's the illusion. If you follow the Northern Pacific Railway heading west, tracing the path of that supposedly unstoppable industrial march, it didn't get all the way.
No, it didn't.
It hit a hard stop at Bismarck in the Dakota Territory.
Yeah?
That was it. End of the line. The system ends here.
And beyond Bismarck, that comforting eastern illusion of control just evaporates into the prairie winds.
Our sources highlight how stark that contrast really was. Because back east, people sitting in their parlors were looking at these carefully curated stereoscopic photographs.
Right, the early 3D pictures.
Yeah, photographers like William Illingworth were traveling out west and sending back these majestic, romanticized images of a tamed frontier.
Packaged for consumption.
Completely. But the reality on the ground was absolute chaos. Just 2 years prior, in 1874, Custer had led an expedition into the Black Hills and found gold.
Which sparked a frenzied, chaotic gold rush directly into Sioux territory.
And that triggered a massive cascade of political and legal consequences that we really need to contextualize for you here.
Right, because the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty had explicitly set aside the Black Hills for the Lakota people.
His sovereign land.
Guaranteed by the United States government. But when thousands of prospectors flooded in looking for gold, the U.S. government shifted its stance.
Rather than removing the miners, they ultimately sought to take control of the region.
Ordering indigenous bands to confine themselves to designated agencies or face military action.
And it is so crucial for you, the listener, to understand that this isn't just some closed chapter of history tucked away in a textbook.
Not at all.
The legal ramifications of that land seizure are still actively unfolding today. In 1980, the United States Supreme Court actually reviewed this history.
And they ruled that the taking of the Black Hills was unlawful.
They ordered a financial payment to the Lakota for the land. With interest, that amounts to well over $100 million today.
But the Lakota have firmly and consistently rejected that money.
Yeah, their stance is rooted in the original treaty. The land was never for sale. It is sacred.
And they are demanding the return of the Black Hills itself, not a financial payout.
It is a profound, ongoing legal and moral dispute over sovereignty that stems directly from the logistical and military events we are analyzing today.
Right, we aren't taking sides here, but it's vital to recognize that the paperwork generated in 1876 is still being debated in courtrooms right now.
Exactly. So, returning to the spring of 1876, the U.S. military is tasked with enforcing this new government mandate.
Which means projecting overwhelming force out into this contested, unmapped territory.
And when you think about how armies operated back then, you think of the Civil War, right? Just a decade prior.
Precision drills.
Yeah. Our sources mention groups like the Zouaves, these volunteer military regiments famous for their incredibly precise, synchronized drills in the eastern cities.
Marching in perfect geometric formations.
Right. But those formations, that kind of rigid geometric control, it completely falls apart when faced with the raw, untamed geography of the West.
Oh, absolutely. If you want to project military power hundreds of miles beyond the end of the railroad, you cannot rely on marching in straight lines.
You have to rely on an entirely different system of movement and supply.
So let's talk about the plan drawn up by General Alfred Terry, because it was massive.
It really was.
Yeah.
It called for 3 separate columns of troops to converge from 3 different directions.
Commanded by Terry, Colonel John Gibbon, and General George Crook.
All trying to trap the native forces across this vast landscape. And just to give you a sense of the sheer scale we're talking about here, General Terry's column alone, marching out of Fort Abraham Lincoln near Bismarck, included the entire 7th Cavalry, infantry units, artillery, and a staggering 1,600 horses and mules.
This is where we need to stop and look at the math.
Because the math is terrifying.
The math of keeping those 1,600 animals alive is a logistical nightmare. If we break this down logically, an army of that size requires 12,000 pounds of grain every single day.
Wow. Every day.
Every single day. And that is just the baseline to keep the animals moving. It doesn't even account for the food and water for the hundreds of human soldiers.
And here is where we hit the fatal flaw of traditional 19th century pioneer transport. The prairie schooner.
We've all seen the Western movies with the long lines of white-covered wagons.
Right.
But mathematically, wagons fail completely on long, fast-moving military campaigns.
Wait, okay, walk me through that. Why does a wagon fail? I mean, it's just a box on wheels.
Because the engine of that wagon, the mules or oxen pulling it, has to eat.
Right.
Let's do the math. A standard military wagon can hold roughly 2,000 pounds of supplies. It's pulled by a team of 6 mules.
Okay, got it.
Each mule needs about 10 pounds of grain a day to survive hard pulling. That means your team of mules is eating 60 pounds of your cargo every single day.
So after 10 days, they've eaten 600 pounds.
Exactly. And after 20 days, they've eaten 1,200 pounds. That is more than half the payload.
That's insane.
By the time you reach day 30 or 40, the animals have consumed the entire payload they are carrying just to survive the journey.
It is a brutal law of diminishing returns.
At a certain distance, a wagon train is basically just a traveling buffet for its own draft animals.
So it cannot project surplus supplies to a fighting force that is hundreds of miles away from a supply depot.
Precisely.
The sources give us such a visceral sense of how agonizing this overland travel was even before the math defeated them.
Right, Elizabeth Custer's diary.
Yes, wife of Lieutenant Colonel George Custer. She accompanied the regiment on some of their earlier marches, and she wrote a memoir called Boots and Saddles.
It paints a horrifying picture of overland travel.
It really does. She describes the sheer weight of the saddles, the bulky equipment, the thousands of rounds of heavy lead ammunition, just making the wagon trains incredibly cumbersome.
They were just bogged down.
She writes about these ramshackly ambulances plunging down steep riverbanks, the terrifying, bone-rattling descent, the mules kicking and screaming, the harnesses snapping.
It was brutal, violent, forced movement.
And that highlights the massive difference between a small pioneer family taking 6 months to slowly cross the plains, stopping to graze their animals along the way, and a massive military strike force.
A strike force needs to move quickly. It needs to arrive at its destination with surplus energy, ready to fight.
You cannot just pause the war to let 1,600 horses graze for a week.
No, you can't.
So I have to ask, if wagons are a mathematical dead end because the mules eat all the food, and you obviously can't build a railroad overnight through hostile territory, how on earth do you project an army into a roadless environment?
The answer was water.
Water,
River transport was exponentially more efficient than overland wagons.
because a boat doesn't eat its own cargo.
Exactly. But, as any systems engineer will tell you, when you rely entirely on one highly efficient method of transport in a hostile environment, you create a massive single point of failure.
Enter the steamboat Far West and her pilot, Captain Grant Marsh.
If there is a main character in our deep dive today who isn't made of flesh and blood, it is this boat.
Absolutely. The Far West was leased by the military to act as the floating supply depot and mobile headquarters for General Terry's army.
It was built in Pittsburgh in 1870.
Right.
It was 190 feet long, over 30 feet wide. But what made it essential wasn't its size. It was its highly specialized design for western rivers.
Right, because navigating the Missouri and the Yellowstone isn't like floating down the deep, placid rivers back east.
Not at all.
These western rivers are shallow, they shift constantly, and they are full of hidden debris.
What's fascinating here is the engineering adaptation required to survive that environment. The Far West was a shallow draft steamboat.
Meaning the hull was flat.
Yes. Unloaded, this massive 190-foot wooden structure drew only 20 inches of water.
Hold on. For the listener trying to picture this, 20 inches? That's barely past your knees.
I know, it's wild.
You're telling me a 190-foot boat is floating in less than 2 feet of water?
Yes, it was essentially a massive floating warehouse shaped like a surfboard.
A surfboard.
And even when it was fully loaded to the brim with 200 tons of freight ammunition, hardtack, grain for the horses, it only sank down into the water about 2.5 feet.
That is just mind-blowing. Our sources talk about modern recreational boating, pointing out things like the sailfish, which is a little 78-pound fiberglass craft you can throw on top of your car.
Right.
Or they mention mass-produced submarine chasers. But the Far West wasn't built for leisure, and it wasn't stamped out on an assembly line.
It was a bespoke, heavy-duty instrument of survival, pure utilitarian mechanical force.
And how did it actually move?
To push that flat hull against the current, it relied on 3 massive high-pressure steam boilers. Those boilers consumed an unbelievable amount of fuel, up to 30 cords of wood a day.
30 cords a day?
Yeah, and the steam powered these massive engines linked to a single 30-foot-wide wooden stern paddle wheel at the back of the boat.
Elizabeth Custer's diaries bring the sensory experience of these boats to life. If you were a passenger, it wasn't a peaceful river cruise.
Oh, I can imagine.
She describes the exhaust from the high-pressure engines booming like artillery fire, echoing off the canyon walls.
Ugh.
The boat had these twin, towering iron chimneys that just poured out thick, black soot and burning ash that would rain down on the deck.
You'd just be covered in it.
You could literally feel the blistering heat of the furnaces through the floorboards beneath your boots. You were essentially sitting on top of a patched, vibrating iron boiler.
Just watching the roaring fire through the chinks in the furnace door.
Constantly terrified that the whole thing is going to explode.
It was a brute force machine. It demanded constant feeding, constant maintenance, and nerves of steel to operate.
But having a shallow draft and a massive steam engine wasn't enough, because the rivers of the West didn't just passively resist.
They actively fought back.
Let's talk about how this machine actually moved through the landscape. The route General Terry's supply line had to follow started on the wide Missouri River, pushing west into the Yellowstone River.
And then turning south, fighting its way up the Bighorn River system.
And as they went further and further upriver, the water got shallower, the channels got narrower, and the physical resistance got stronger.
The Missouri River alone is notoriously hostile. It reinvents its own geography every single year.
Right.
The spring snowmelt turns the river into a violent fire hose, ripping up mature cottonwood trees right from the banks,
And then it tumbles these massive trees and plants their heavy root balls deep in the mud.
leaving the jagged trunks pointing downstream just beneath the surface.
Snags.
Yes, snags. They were essentially submerged wooden spears that could punch a hole right through a wooden hull in a fraction of a second.
Terrifying.
But the real nightmare for a steamboat pilot was summer, when the water levels dropped, revealing a constantly shifting maze of sandbars.
And this is where the Far West had to perform a mechanical maneuver that just blows my mind.
Grasshoppering.
Yes. When they hit a sandbar that was too shallow even for their 20-inch draft, they didn't just turn around and give up. They used this technique called grasshoppering.
This is a perfect example of mechanical leverage overcoming geographical limits.
Explain how it works.
To grasshopper, the crew utilized two massive, incredibly heavy wooden poles, known as spars. These were rigged upright near the front of the boat.
Okay.
When the Far West grounded hard on a mudbank, the crew would lower these spars and plant them firmly into the riverbed, angling them forward.
Wait, like giant wooden crutches?
Exactly like crutches. The tops of these spars were connected to heavy ropes and block and tackle, rigging a system of pulleys to multiply pulling force.
Right.
Those ropes were attached to steam-powered capstans on the deck.
Okay, before we go on, what is a capstan exactly? For someone trying to visualize the mechanics on the deck.
Think of a capstan as a giant vertical winch or spool. Instead of sailors pushing it around by hand, it was hooked directly to the boat's steam engine.
Okay, I see it.
So they plant the wooden crutches in the mud. The steam engine turns the capstan, pulling the ropes tight through the pulleys, and through the sheer mechanical torque of the steam engine, they would literally hoist the entire front of the 190-foot steamboat into the air.
They just lift the bow right out of the water.
Yes, they physically pry the boat up. And while the bow is suspended in the air on these wooden stilts, the engineer would throttle the massive paddle wheel in the back.
Pushing it forward.
The paddle wheel churns the mud, driving the suspended hull forward a few feet, sliding it violently over the sandbar. Then they drop the boat, reset the poles further ahead, and do it again. Lift, push, drop, lift, push, drop.
That must have looked completely insane from the riverbank.
A giant mechanical insect.
A giant, smoke-belching, hissing mechanical insect physically crawling over the mud on spindly wooden legs.
It really forces you to realize that this is not smooth sailing.
Not at all. This is forced, violent movement through immense physical resistance. Contrast that brute force with the indigenous river travel that Elizabeth Custer
A
observed.
bull boat.
Yeah, she described seeing these perfectly round coracles, often called bull boats, made by Native Americans. They were constructed of a single buffalo hide stretched over a light willow wicker frame.
Very lightweight.
They weighed almost nothing. They sat right on top of the water like a leaf, and they floated effortlessly, spinning with the erratic currents. They worked with the environment.
While the U.S. Army was trying to bludgeon the environment into submission.
Exactly. And they were incredibly desperate to achieve that submission. Our sources even point to congressional memorials from this era. Politicians and business leaders in places like Oregon were literally begging the federal government to build boat railways.
Right. They wanted to lay down actual railroad tracks around river rapids.
So they could put steamboats on giant wheeled cradles and drag them around the unnavigable parts of the river. That is how vital water transport was and how impossible the western rivers could be.
But even the Far West, with all its brute force, steam power, and grasshoppering over mudbanks, had a physical limit.
It had to end somewhere.
By late June of 1876, the boat fights its way up to the mouth of the Rosebud River, a small tributary feeding into the Yellowstone.
And this is where General Terry, Colonel Gibbon, and Lieutenant Colonel Custer hold a final, fateful strategy meeting right there in the dimly lit cabin of the Far West.
We need to pause at this specific geographic location because the spot represents the logistical horizon.
The absolute edge.
The Far West physically cannot go any further up these shallow tributaries. The water is simply too low. The river has dictated the absolute limit of America's industrial and military reach at this exact moment in history. The machine literally cannot push another inch.
Think about the tension in that cabin. You can picture the landscape outside those windows at this limit. The troops are looking out at this vast, rolling, deeply cut terrain of ridges and ravines.
They are about to step off into the absolute unknown.
Our sources note that indigenous groups, like the Shoshone and the Lakota, possessed a profound fluidity of migration. They lived off the land, they moved with the buffalo herds. Their entire society was mobile and adapted to the plains.
But the U.S. Army was entirely tethered.
They were astronauts tied to an umbilical cord. And the Far West was their mothership, holding all their rations, all their heavy ammunition, and their only link to the outside world.
Which brings up the critical tactical problem that Terry and Custer are debating in that cabin. The massive native encampment they are looking for is believed to be miles away, further upriver, deep into the broken country.
So what happens when your military objective, the enemy you were ordered to engage, is 30 miles past your logistical horizon?
You have to make a choice. You either retreat where you cut the line.
And that is exactly what happens. On June 22nd, Custer and the 7th Cavalry detached from the supply network.
If we look at this through the lens of systems and logistics, it is a massive existential risk. A unit of over 600 men is voluntarily disconnecting from its life support.
Custer is stripping his column down to move fast.
He takes a pack train of mules, about 12 mules per command, carrying extra ammunition and very limited rations.
To maximize their speed and mobility in this rough terrain, they leave all their heavy equipment behind on the boat. They leave their heavy sabers. Custer even refuses General Terry's offer to take a battery of Gatling guns, arguing they would slow him down.
They are stepping off the edge of the world.
The historical accounts describe the sensory details of this departure. Custer is wearing his fringed buckskins. He is mounted on his horse, Dandy,
He is literally prancing out of camp.
while the regimental band plays their traditional tune, Gary Owen. He turns and waves a confident goodbye to General Terry and Colonel Gibbon.
And right here is where we hit a massive historical and legal controversy that is deeply embedded in our sources.
Did Custer willfully disobey General Terry's orders by turning west too early and attacking the village alone, rather than waiting for the other slow-moving columns to converge?
It is arguably the most debated question in American military history. General Terry's written orders gave Custer a specific, circuitous route to follow southward,
The goal was for Custer to act as a blocking force.
preventing the native forces from escaping into the mountains, hoping to trap them between the converging columns on a specific date, June 26th.
General Terry later claimed, both publicly and privately, that Custer's blatant disobedience of these written orders ruined this grand, synchronized strategy and led to his own destruction.
But the sources also provide compelling counter-evidence. There's an incredible legal affidavit from Mary Adams.
She was a black woman who worked as a cook for the Custer family.
She was physically present on the far west during that final strategy meeting in the cabin.
Years later, she swore an affidavit stating she heard General Terry tell Custer directly, "Use your own judgment and do what you think best if you strike the trail."
Which perfectly highlights how ambiguous military command can be when you are operating at the extreme edge of the frontier.
Even Terry's written orders contained a crucial loophole, explicitly stating that he didn't want to impose precise, rigid orders that might hamper Custer's ability to react when he finally came into contact with the enemy.
But from an analytical perspective, regardless of who is to blame for the tactics, the systemic reality is undeniable. Once Custer rides over those bluffs and disappears into the dust, the umbilical cord is cut.
Far West is left behind, and the commanders left on the river are completely blind.
Which leads to this agonizing, suffocating period of silence.
Think about the last time you lost cell service for a few hours and felt entirely disconnected. Now multiply that by 1,000 days of waiting on the river in a total information vacuum.
This period of waiting really underscores the fragility of 19th century information systems. We live in a world of real-time data, drone feeds, and satellite communication.
But back then, once you step past the telegraph lines, data only moves as fast as a human or a horse can physically travel over rough terrain.
When a cavalry column detaches into the wilderness, there is literally no way to know the outcome. You do not know if they are victorious or if they're dead until someone physically survives, turns around, and rides back to tell you.
The psychological tension must have been unbearable. General Terry and Colonel Gibbon begin marching their slow-moving infantry overland, following Custer's general direction, leaving the far west moored to the riverbank.
The river just flows by.
This massive, passive observer to history. Every shadow on the horizon, every dust cloud could be a victorious messenger or an incoming ambush.
And hundreds of miles away, back at Fort Lincoln, the wives of the soldiers, including Elizabeth Custer, are waiting in the same agonizing vacuum of news.
She wrote beautifully and tragically about this feeling, stating that it is infinitely worse to be left behind, a prey to all the horrors of imagining what may be happening.
That deafening silence holds for days, until it is finally broken.
Not by a triumphant courier bringing news of a grand victory, but by the staggering, traumatized return of survivors.
The news arrives at the river, and it is absolute devastation.
The unimaginable has happened. Custer's immediate command, 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry, has been completely annihilated at the Little Bighorn. Over 200 soldiers are dead on a dusty hillside.
And to compound the disaster, they also learned that General Crook's massive column, which was supposed to be moving up from the south as the lower jaw of the trap, had already been fought to a standstill at the Battle of the Rosebud over a week earlier and had retreated entirely.
In an instant, The offensive logistical system has completely collapsed.
The grand pincer movement, the synchronized trap drawn up on a map, has failed spectacularly.
The entire nature of the military operation pivots on a dime. It is no longer a strike mission. It instantly becomes a desperate rescue, recovery, and triage operation for the surviving units pinned down on the bluffs above the river.
The emotional whiplash is hard to fathom.
The Far West, this mechanical beast of war that hauled the ammunition, is suddenly stripped of its remaining supplies. Captain Marsh and his crew throw crates of valuable cargo right off the deck onto the riverbank to make room for humanity.
The boat transforms almost magically into a makeshift hospital ship.
They cover the hard wooden decks in freshly cut prairie grass and tarpaulins to make beds. They load 50 severely wounded, bleeding soldiers onto the deck.
They even hoist a severely injured cavalry horse aboard.
Comanche.
Right, Comanche, who was the only U.S. survivor found on the immediate battlefield where Custer fell.
And now this steamboat, which fought so hard for weeks, grasshoppering and scraping its way to crawl upstream, faces a terrifying, desperate escape downstream.
They need to get these dying men to a real hospital.
This is the legendary run of the Far West. Captain Grant March is given a direct order: get these wounded men back to the railhead and the hospital at Bismarck as fast as humanly possible.
That is a distance of 710 miles of twisting, treacherous river.
Let's break down the physics of this run, because it is the mechanical centerpiece of this entire story.
Going upstream was a slow, agonizing struggle against physical resistance. Going downstream is entirely different. It is incredibly fast because you now have the full, violent force of the spring snowmelt pushing you along.
Right.
But that speed introduces a terrifying new variable. It removes almost all of your steering control.
Hold on, that seems totally counterintuitive. If you were going down a dangerous river full of rocks and snags, wouldn't you want to go as slow as possible to carefully navigate and avoid hitting things? Why does going faster give you control?
It comes down to fluid dynamics and how our rudder works.
Okay.
A rudder only turns a boat if water is moving past it, creating friction and pressure. If the river current is moving at 10 miles an hour and you let your boat drift so it is also moving at 10 miles an hour, the water surrounding the rudder is relatively stationary.
So it does nothing.
The rudder has absolutely no bite. You are just a helpless piece of driftwood spinning in the current. If you want to steer a steamboat going downstream, you must propel the boat faster than the current.
Faster than the river itself.
Yes. If the river is moving at 10 miles an hour, you have to push the boat to 15 miles an hour. That gives you 5 miles an hour of water pressure pushing against the rudder to give you steerage.
Okay, that makes terrifying sense. To stay safe, you have to outrun the river.
Exactly. Which means Captain Marsh orders his engineers to give maximum effort. Mechanically, this is a nightmare.
Why?
It means the crew in the boiler room are shoveling 30 cords of wood into those 3 furnaces as fast as humanly possible. The steam pressure inside the iron boilers is pushed to the absolute red line, right to the brink of a catastrophic explosion.
Oh my God.
The safety valves are hissing and screaming under the pressure. Every single wooden timber in the 190-foot hull is vibrating violently from the RPMs of the paddle wheel.
I want you to picture this scene in your mind.
Yeah.
It is 54 hours of constant adrenaline-fueled terror.
They are flying down the narrow, winding Bighorn River, blasting out into the wider Yellowstone, and sweeping into the muddy Missouri.
Captain Marsh refuses to stop for nightfall, which was standard practice.
Ah!
They are rocketing through the pitch-black darkness, reading the ripples on the water by moonlight to avoid shifting sandbars.
They are blindly dodging those submerged cottonwood trees, those snags that could rip the bottom out of the boat in a second and drown everyone on board.
And up on the deck, you have 50 wounded men, many with shattered bones and gunshot wounds, groaning in agony with every massive shudder of the hull as the boat scrapes over the shallows.
The 2 iron chimneys are pouring out a continuous stream of glowing sparks into the night sky, looking like a massive Roman candle streaking through the wilderness.
It is a sheer miracle that the boat didn't hit a hidden log and sink immediately, or that those overpressured boilers didn't just detonate and blow the boat to splinters.
The very engineering features that made the boat perfect for slowly crawling upstream, that shallow 20-inch draft, that massive heavy wheel at the back, turned it into a barely controllable, hyper-fast rocket when going downstream.
But Captain Marsh holds it together. He reads the river perfectly. After 54 grueling nonstop hours covering an unbelievable 710 miles, the crew spots the familiar, comforting banks of Bismarck.
The arrival. The moment the bow of the Far West touches the wooden dock at Fort Abraham Lincoln.
This moment is profound if you view it through systems theory.
The arrival of the Far West represents a physical reconnection to the national infrastructure. The period of absolute physical isolation in the wilderness is over.
They have successfully relinked with the railroad network.
And, crucially, they have reconnected with the telegraph wire.
The transfer of the wounded soldiers to the post hospital begins immediately, a somber procession off the deck. But simultaneously, there is a mad, desperate dash by reporters and military couriers to the local telegraph office in Bismarck.
Because the physical journey of the boat is finally over, but the informational journey is about to explode across the continent.
This contrast perfectly illustrates the two distinct speeds of the 19th century. First, you have the slow, brutal physical movement. It took maximum mechanical effort, the terrifying risk of boiler explosion, and 54 harrowing hours just to move 710 miles back to civilization.
But once that disastrous news is translated into Morse code and hits the telegraph wire,
It jumps across the entire North American continent to the East Coast almost instantly. It travels electronically at the speed of light.
and think about where that electronic message lands. Remember the opening frame we talked about?
The centennial celebration in Philadelphia.
The news of Custer's total annihilation hits the newspapers just as the country is celebrating its 100th birthday.
That comforting illusion of unchallenged American industrial power, the neat curated exhibits of the Corliss engine, the stereoscopic photos showing a tamed, romantic West, it is shattered in an instant.
The entire nation is thrown into profound shock. The frontier was not yet a curated museum exhibition. It was violently, successfully resisting.
So we have to ask, what is the ultimate result of this systemic failure? The immediate military campaign failed tactically. The pincer movement collapsed.
But structurally, what the campaign truly accomplished was exposing the absolute limits of the current infrastructure.
And in response to that exposure, the United States government didn't retreat. They didn't rethink their expansion.
They doubled down with overwhelming industrial force. They commissioned more steamboats, built more supply depots, and eventually drove the railroads straight through that contested territory to permanently subjugate the region.
Logistics is destiny.
Once the steel rails and deepwater ports were established, the frontier ceased to be an unpredictable edge of the world. It became an administered, manageable territory.
And as that infrastructure became permanent, it didn't just bring soldiers. It brought entirely new populations, new economies, and new industries to places like Montana and the Dakotas.
Our sources highlight some fascinating, often overlooked ripples of this massive expansion.
For instance, the very same Missouri River steamboat corridor that carried General Terry's army also carried Black Americans seeking new opportunities away from the post-Civil War South.
The sources mention steamboats like the Nellie Peck bringing people upriver to Fort Benton.
Black men served as soldiers in the region, men like William D. Davis, who was stationed in Montana and was so deeply involved in the logistics of cavalry movement that he later patented a specialized military riding saddle.
And eventually, as the infrastructure solidified, the violence of 1876 faded into history, and those same logistical networks allowed those contested lands to be transformed into destinations for mass tourism and recreation.
We see the establishment of sweeping national parks.
We see monumental landscape-altering architecture, like sculptor Gutzon Borglum using dynamite and drills to carve Mount Rushmore into the very Black Hills that sparked the war.
Projecting a literal stone narrative of American empire. We even see famous architects like Frank Lloyd Wright designing concepts like the Horseshoe Inn for tourists visiting Estes Park in Colorado.
The terrifying edge of the world, where the Far West fought for survival, became a scenic vacation spot.
It is incredible to trace that line from a desperate, soot-covered steamboat to a family taking a road trip to a national park. Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to chew on.
Right now, as we speak, modern underwater archaeological surveys are actually mapping the murky riverbed of the Little Bighorn River.
They were using advanced pulse induction metal detectors to scan the mud, looking for artifacts dropped mullets, brass buttons, pieces of saddle equipment, lost by the soldiers as they frantically fled across the water 150 years ago.
It really makes you pause and wonder about our own footprint.
It does. It forces us to look around at our own modern world. Think about our current limits of infrastructure, the massive server farms cooling the internet, the millions of miles of fiber optic cables laid across the ocean floor, the global supply chains we assume are so permanent and indestructible.
How much of our own grand modern history will eventually just be metallic echoes buried in the mud waiting for future generations to dig up and analyze?
The systems and the infrastructure we build define exactly what is possible in our era. But history shows us time and time again that they are always fragile.
That is the real lesson here.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. We hope you walk away remembering that true history is rarely just about the famous people standing in the spotlight on the stage. It is about the stage itself and the incredible, complex, groaning machinery holding it up in the dark. Keep questioning the systems around you. Because the story of the Little Bighorn did not travel by horse. It traveled by water.